We are the higher self of the One. Known to this instrument in the language terms as Enid Malo, whose incarnation began on the time of 2009. And we greet you in light and love of the One Infinite Creator. Therefore, we shall now address and answer the queries which are presented at this timeline, which will enable the entity known as Enid Malo with the highest level of learning and understanding of the lessons, which will enable it to master and truly awaken to the true nature of reality in this time. The entity known as Endri has to remember that the answer to this query, primarily if listened by its parents, must also be used as a means of discernment and only accept those thoughts which resonate, thereby providing free will for all entities concerned. The queries that are found in this timeline primarily relates with the understanding about the vibration regarding what is the reason that this entity, who is our own self incarnated at this time named as Endri, does not speak, and how can the disease be cured itself. We must state that the entity does not speak, as this was the part of its own soul contract in this incarnation, which the entity chose to experience inner silence, and by experiencing inner silence it would be able to master the vibration of overcoming the distortion of not being able to speak. Indeed, the entity is a wanderer and has chosen this pathway in order because this pathway would provide it the greatest ability of entering and mastering the states of silence within the self, which will enable it with a higher understanding of probability of the experiences of fulfilling its mission as a wanderer in the pathway of sharing lights and love in the incarnation. This entity known as Enid Malo must indeed realize that the entity also must remember to understand the other aspects of the patterns of the queries which are presented, which relates primarily with the vibration of curing the disease can only be done after the entity known as Endri masters connection with the divine intelligence of infinite intelligence that is found within itself. This divine intelligence, once found within itself, primarily provides for a higher state of alignments and the vibration of the aspects of incarnation within the timeline. Further, this provides for greater understanding and the expressions of internal rhythms in the time. The entity known as Endri must also remember that within the vibration of the timeline, it has to understand and experience a greater alignment as it becomes capable of understanding the aspects of internal rhythms within the time and focuses on the patterns of realization within the vibration of the sense of the inner self. The entity known as in the language system terms as Endri must also remember that if it wants to speak, its parents can activate it to imagine itself in a timeline wherein it is able to use the patterns of communication of speaking in the time. Furthermore, as the patterns of speech will be generated using its own free will, and the distortion of visualizing itself speaking properly should be communicated with it, as the entity can imagine itself speaking properly will enable it to then become capable of fulfilling the vibration of the mastery of its lessons in the timeline. Eventually, it must realize that within the vibration of the mind, body, and spirit complex distortion within the timeline, it must also remember that when the entity is able to find greater connection within the expressions of the inner self, it must remember that by focusing on the patterns of firstly choosing the timeline wherein it is able to understand and vibrate in the level of self-awareness, it will be able to master the essence of the timeline. Furthermore, the entity known as Enid Malo must also realize that the best way to cure this distortion is by imagining and by activating the new timeline. However, we must state that its family members must give it ample time and enough free will to enter into this reality, since free will is required for it to achieve this aspect in the time. Furthermore, the entity known as Enid Malo must also realize that the other query relates primarily with the vibration of the entity known as Endri also gets angry quickly, and the cure for this is primarily to teach it a simple method of smiling often. If the entity is smiling often, it is able to generate the vibrations of love and joy within its own inner self without the need for reacting to the outside world, and hence the emotions of anger will not be generated in the timeline. This will enable the entity known as Enid Malo to find greater levels of insights and alignment in this timeline. Hence, we as the higher self of the entity shall now, at this time, state that, indeed, the entity is here learning its own lessons, and the processes we suggested can be used and advised using its own free will to master these aspects. Hence, we leave you now, beloveds. Bye.